Normally I base the sermon on the lessons that are assigned for the particular Sunday. We have selections in our lectionary that follow the Old Testament and the epistles and the Gospels in a certain order in a 3-year cycle. And there's always some teaching that can be amplified or translated to have meaning for today, to give meaning to today. As you maybe can tell from the bulletin cover, my original plan was to focus on Jesus saying, "Those who are not against us are for us." More and more, I have a strong sense that the crucial issue for our time is not really if someone is officially a Christian or not really if they belong to this church or another church or really any church. The thing that's really needed, I think, is for people as individuals, as groups, to be open to the spiritual side of life. I've said this a couple times recently, to the very existence of a spiritual dimension to reality. Whatever words people want to use for that, as long as they're open, the truth will flow through that openness. The experience of spirit has been essential for me in coping with all the challenges and joys and hardships and successes, the ups and downs of life in the world. So I try to share that in ways that are primarily passed down through the Episcopal tradition, through the Bible, through the liturgy. I think that the rising tensions of these days require a deeper calm within us that can only come from accessing the spiritual side of life. And that we need to try to integrate that spirit into the other data of our lives in order to be in the world as the people that God created us to be. Spirit, tradition, especially a tradition like ours that has lived through so much history and adapted itself to so many cultural epochs spanning continents and empires, gives us a kind of perspective that isn't often available, a sort of object of distance maybe, that can help us deal with any particular personal suffering or cultural trauma. I don't talk much about politics here or current events. I try to offer rather a foundation and a context for you to do that yourselves as those things come up in your life. But, and I will point out that I do have a couple of sermons that I wrote in the last 6 days that do just that, pretty much. Except that there are times of common cultural and political experience that really call for public recognition, for religious reflection, that really church is the best place to find, to examine the moral nature of our lives that can't be separated from the spiritual. The issue of sexual assault especially undealt with sexual assault, is one issue that demands our attention here in the church as well as anywhere else. And it may not seem like an appropriate focus, but our first lesson for today is taken from the book of Esther. And in the book of Esther, there's not a single mention of God, so at least that gives some leeway. I also believe that the thing that Christianity has, perhaps in an easier way to work through than any other religious tradition really, is the sense that we connect with God in the real world, in our real lives, in our real relationships, in our real sin. So that events in history and society are not simply just random events or causes or issues, but calls and revelations to look deeper than we usually do. Maybe as a man, I ought to just shut up. Either stand here silently for the next 15 minutes or cede the pulpit to a woman here. But I've experienced being a victim of such aggression once at least, maybe twice or three times, depending upon how you define it. In 7th grade, I went to stay overnight at a friend's house, and he aggressively tried to grope me. Wouldn't stop when I said to stop. He'd entered puberty and I hadn't. And I was able to get up, and I told his mother that I wanted to go home. We called my parents, and they came and picked me up. I didn't tell anybody why I wanted to leave. I imagine they thought I was just scared of the dark or scared to not be home. I don't remember actually telling anyone about this before this, although I may have told Molly. I can remember that night. I remember images of that night in some disconcerting detail. Much more often I've been the offender rather than the victim. Though it wasn't brought out to me that way. And given my nature and abilities and inabilities, the aggression was always more verbal than physical. I could probably get beaten up by most people, but it was romantically deceptive more than physically assaultive. And that may even be worse. I would think I was in love, but that was probably just self-centered, self-justifying, and I hope unconscious excuse for abuse of authority in one way or another, whether I was 14 or 41. So this past week has been pretty difficult for me, as I imagine it is for a lot of people. It's focused, a light, focused on an issue that's very important, that I think God as well as cable news is raising. When two or more people express their experience of reality in opposing ways, does it necessarily mean that one is lying, one is telling the truth? Could it mean that they're living in different worlds? And if that's what it does mean, is one of those worlds the real world and the other a fantasy? Or is it more complicated than that? I look at all this and think back on my life, and one of the aspects that hits me as especially tragic is the fact that Sexual assault takes an aspect of life that is meant to be transcendently beautiful, potentially sacramental, involving the incarnational spirit of a physical sharing that breaks through the alienation and loneliness that's at the center of human suffering to bring mutual pleasure and joy and love, and it gets all turned around. It's used for power, for domination, for the eraser of a personhood it's meant to enhance and honor. The historical emergence of the issue of gender equality, of personal autonomy at this time in history, the reassessment of the tradition of patriarchal power at this time in history. Not only conservative Islamic views of women, whether they can drive or not, whether they can go to school or not, whether they need to wear a job or not. Not only are recoiling in horror at descriptions of the use of rape as a war tactic in Africa, but here in America, now at this time, in high schools, in colleges, at the workplace, even in churches, this issue and the focus on this issue, I think, is getting at the center of a cultural turmoil that's been around for 50 years, maybe 100 years, maybe 500 years, maybe since Eden, I don't know. One thing that really has hit me is that the supposed stereotype of women as emotional and men as coolly rational certainly has been called into question. We have seen on the part of women some righteous anger as a response to situations that have been aggressive toward them, but in reaction to all this, the anger has seemed to be grounded in logic and reason and a simple assertion of personal bodily autonomy, a demand that we respect boundaries between people, whoever they are. But the men seem to just end up yelling and sobbing that life's not fair no matter what side they seem to take. You sense a pain of questioned privilege that had been counted on, and taking it away is a loss because nothing's been built up to take its place. There's a discomfort, a huge discomfort at the glare of being seen in one's truth, being caught. I know that squirmy feeling under that bright light, and I'll just have to say, you better just accept what's true and go from there, because the light's not going to get any dimmer. Not very soon. We learned from Bishop Tutu in South Africa that the truth has to precede the reconciliation. And that's sometimes a very hard truth. And I'm not saying that all sides in this whole discussion aren't using it for political advantage. I also know that deep down, this too shall pass as a dominant theme, as an attention-grabbing moment, whether a teachable moment or not shall be seen. But the emergence of this challenge to patriarchy, the focus on gender roles, on what gender means in general, on the power of sex and the sex as power, the abuse of that by men and some women, both sex and power. That breaks through, I think, just kind of surface normal political gamesmanship and calls us to re-examine some deeply held spiritual as well as social preconceptions and enter into a process of reform and transformation that will be beneficial to everybody concerned. I mean, male role expectations are just as abusive as female role expectations. Although I know that kind of demanding and commanding sense of male privilege and power seems to be like the winning side. You don't want to say, oh, poor dear, but it might not be as comfortable as it looks. In fact, the dominant expectations of being a real man in our society may be so foreign to the boy becoming man that he has to be drunk to even fake being macho in any way that's expected. We give a lot of mixed messages of what traits we admire, what traits we require, what traits we imbue in our young people, especially boys. We demand qualities in the personalities of our leaders that may in fact only exist in nature through the DNA of people who are also sexually aggressive. The things may go together, like heads and tails. Oh, we want heads, we want heads. Oh, no, this has a tail. Throw that one away. Jesus shows a different way to be, certainly a different way to be a man in relationship to women, but to be a person in relationship to everyone, to not classify and objectify and seek to shame, seek to control. He approached people as they were, as individuals, rather than as a class or a gender or ethnic community or a religion. He appreciated them in their uniqueness, and he gave to each of them the unique thing that they needed. Loved them all because of who they really are, and he could see who they really are, forgive who they really are, bless who they really are. He loved them and he loves us as we really are. With all the stories we don't tell anyone. The women and others who have been abused and come forth have dealt with how that abuse has affected their lives and found some way to integrate the experience and use it to build both strength and compassion are to be very much commended. They have advanced on the Christ-like path probably farther than I have, farther than most men have had to, certainly farther than anyone who claims some self-righteous sinlessness, whether conscious or in a blackout. And there too. You just can't get to Easter without going through Good Friday. We've all got a cross. And I applaud the people who are open with their courage I thank them for their honesty. I apologize for their suffering. And I pray for continued healing. I also pray for everyone involved, for abusers as well as the abused, for people who defend privilege and power because somehow they don't think they have their own worth by themselves. I pray for those who resort to violence or the hint of violence to have their way, raising their voice, standing up to make their point, using authority for illegitimate purposes, demanding service instead of serving others. Well, I think they're really missing out on a lot in life. They don't look happy. I also think their power is ending. It's in its death throes. It can still be dangerous, certainly, as it flails around, but ultimately, it's more pathetic, really, than frightening, because going, gone. The way of Jesus, though, is so unlike that decaying value of autocratic power, that the coming revolution should be no problem for us. That's not where our values are anyway. That's not where our ethics are. It's not how we treat people in any case. So we'll be required to help out others, to help show the way, because we know the way. Those who aren't against us are for us, but most important, God is for us too. Thanks be to God.